Debt is neo-colonialism. These are the words of Marxist revolutionary and former president of Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, proclaimed in his celebrated 1987 call for an African united front against debt. Within a year, he would be dead in what was likely a Western-backed assassination. What did Sankara mean with these words, and why was his call to break the shackles of debt deemed so dangerous to the world order that it likely contributed to his death? My name is Michael Gallant. I'm the co-chair of the DSA International Committee's Climate and Economics Subcommittee. Thank you for joining us today for the second session in the International Committee's new series, An Introduction to Global Economics. Each month, we'll be looking at a new actor or dynamic in the global economy, from debt to the IMF, to the rules of trade, to dollar hegemony and beyond. If you haven't already, you can catch last month's event, An Opening Introduction, featuring Adam Getachew, Jason Hickel, and David Kotz on YouTube and our social pages. This month, we are looking at debt, specifically sovereign debt in the global south, and it couldn't be more timely. Just in the last few weeks, a new UN report was released describing the world as, quote, on the brink of a global debt crisis, under conditions that they also describe as, quote, a perfect storm. As we will hear today, debt is one of the defining features of contemporary global capitalism and the neo-colonial world order that we have. And it is only through the breaking of these shackles of global debt that we can build the world that we wish to see. It is for these reasons that our subcommittee actually just recently voted to make Global South debt cancellation the focus of our campaigning for the coming year. We hope that this session will serve as a valuable introduction to that work. Before I introduce our speakers, a bit of the usual housekeeping. This event will be recorded and the recording will be shared afterwards. This event will consist of introductory remarks from each speaker, followed by a Q&A. Please put any questions that you may have in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll hope to answer them at the end. Please don't use the chat for questions, but do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It'd be good to get a sense of who all is here. A quick thank you to the work of Carrington Morris, Adam Ray, David Kotz, Chiro Fayenza, Melanie Bressler, and many more for making this event possible. And now to introduce our speakers for whose participation we are very grateful. Heidi Chow is the executive director of the UK-based organization Debt Justice, which actually just recently changed its name to that, I think this very week, from what you may know it as the Jubilee Debt Campaign UK. May Buenaventura is the Debt Justice lead at the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, a transnational regional alliance of people's movements, community organizations, coalitions, and networks fighting for social transformation. And Natalia Renta is a policy expert and activist whose work and research has focused on the specific case of debt justice and Puerto Rico. Natalia is here to give us a glimpse into the role that debt has played in the maintenance of empire in Puerto Rico. So thank you all again for joining. I'm really excited about this session personally. So let's get to it. Over to you, Heidi. Oh,
sorry, yeah, muted. Yeah, complete rookie mistake there. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, and thank you, Michael, for hosting this event today. And I'm really yeah, glad that you guys are covering this topic. It's an incredibly important and urgent issue that you've already kind of mentioned. Right now, there is a debt crisis, and it's engulfing the global south. Our analysis shows that there are 54 countries that are in debt crisis. And we define a debt crisis to mean that essential resources are being diverted away from healthcare, education, and other essential public services to make debt repayments, and often to banks and hedge funds that are set to make huge profits if they're paid back in full. And this debt crisis has been brewing for over a decade, and debt payments are now currently at their highest levels since 2001. And unfortunately, things are set to get worse. The prices of basic food and fuel are surging at the moment. This is going to create even more pressure for countries who are already struggling to make ends meet. Global South countries are also on the front lines of the climate crisis and being forced into debt to tackle the climate emergency and building resilience, but also being forced into debt just to respond to climate disasters like floods and hurricanes. And vaccine apartheid means that while countries like the UK here, in Europe and in the US, we're all now living without the COVID restrictions, but many countries in the global south are still dealing with the impacts and the economic disruption that's coming from the pandemic. And so the only way to release resources immediately is to help countries face these multiple and to help these countries face multiple intersecting crises is to cancel their debt, and in the longer term to change the debt system to prevent these recurring debt crises happening over and over again. So I'm just going to take a step back and cover where this debt has come from. And essentially, global South debt is a systemic problem. So I'm going to provide you a bit of a potted history of how debt has been used as a tool of exploitation and control, talk about the systemic nature of the debt, and then I'm going to move on to some of the specific developments that have happened over the last decade that has driven this current debt problem. And then hopefully we'll have some time before I finish my time slot to just cover what can be done about it as well. So first of all, I mentioned essentially we have a structural problem. It's a systemic problem. Our global economy has long been organized around the interests of corporations and wealthy governments with its roots in colonialism. But even after independence, these interests have been continued to be sustained by wealthy governments, policies and corporate activities, such as corporate tax avoidance and tax evasion, illicit financial flows, repatriation of profits by multinational corporations, and unfair trade rules and unfair trade deals. All of these combined have essentially diverted income away from lower income countries and into the hands of rich governments and corporations. And collectively, these policies have kept global South economies locked into a colonial style economy with a heavy reliance on raw materials being extracted and exported to the global North. And the UN has said that 101 countries are still dependent on the export of raw materials. So this means that the global South countries are hugely vulnerable to the volatility that's inherent in global commodity markets. And it ultimately means that they've struggled to build diversified, resilient economies. And so the long arm of colonialism, even after independence, means that many global South countries are forced to use debt to publicly finance areas of public finance, public spending, like healthcare, like education. So in the 1970s, there was a very big push on lending to the global South, partly because the banking system was awash with cash from the OPEC oil crisis, and partly because loans were being used as a weapon in the Cold War. And as countries went through the debt crisis in the 1980s, the IMF and World Bank lent more money and essentially bailed out those banks and hedge funds that had undertaken risky lending in the 1970s. And then the World Bank and IMF loans came with policy conditions, both during the 1980s and 1990s, but even to this day, debt has been used as a weapon to powerfully control and shape the economies of global South countries to serve corporate and imperial interests. So economies were forced to implement policies of austerity and privatization to raise cash for repaying the debt. So in other words, putting debt repayment above delivering people's basic needs. Countries also had to liberalize their markets. So, for example, cutting trade tariffs, opening up markets to foreign competitors, and deregulation. So curbing regulations in areas like labor and environment in order to attract more investment. But the idea behind the imposition of liberalization and deregulation was to help these countries grow their way out of debt, to essentially gear their economies for export to earn the money to repay these debts. But these policies only kept global South countries underdeveloped and instead increased the power of multinational corporations and prevented global South countries from developing the same way that Northern countries have developed. Now, across Latin America and Africa and Asia, these policies, this one-size-fits-all prescription meant that economies shrank and ultimately debt just kept increasing as a percentage of GDP. Michael mentioned Thomas Sankara at the introduction of this event. Thomas Sankara came to power in 1983 in Burkina Faso and was president for just 4 years before he was assassinated. And he came to power in the middle of the global South debt crisis of the 1980s. And he saw very clearly how debt had come to be used as an incredibly convenient, but also very effective way to maintain the economic power of the global North. He described the officials from the IMF and the World Bank as colonizers who had transformed themselves into technical assassins. And he famously said, debt cannot be repaid. First, because if we don't repay, lenders will not die. That is for sure. But if we repay, we are going to die. That is also for sure. And that was his rallying call to build a debt resistance across the global south. And it was only, as Michael mentioned at the beginning, it was only just a few months later when he was assassinated. Now, it's widely suspected that the French government backed Sankara's assassination because it was so alarmed by his anti-imperial rhetoric and his rejection of debt payments, and for calling out the use of debt in the neo-colonial project. So we essentially have a system that's been built up through the global rules, through the rules of the global economy that have been essentially stitched up by corporations, by wealthy governments that have essentially rigged the rules for the global south. And so we have a situation now where global south countries are structurally predisposed to really harmful levels of debt. And so all it takes is an external shock to plunge countries into a debt crisis. And so that's exactly what's been happening in the last 10 years. So I'm just going to summarize the key developments that have led to the current buildup of debt. So going back to the 2008 financial crisis, just after the financial crisis, interest rates plummeted in the West. And so there was a boom in lending as speculators could make more money from the global south. And then in 2014, the prices of raw materials fell, things like oil and metals and so on. And because many countries are dependent on selling these raw materials, these commodities, this price drop meant to a massive drop in income, and therefore forcing countries to borrow more. So countries were already in a debt crisis before COVID hit, but then in 2020, as the pandemic started hitting different countries around the world, the Chinese economy slowed down first, followed by Western economies. And then again, this led to another fall in commodity prices. Money moved out of the global south in the largest recorded capital outflow, and interest rates went up again. And then lockdowns in the West led to a massive drop-off in remittance income, which is a really important source of income for global south countries. So this is the income that diaspora communities send back home to their families and their communities. So that also dropped off as lockdown in the West meant that people were no longer able to work or struggled to work. So as a result of this growing debt crisis, the G20 set up a scheme for debt relief called the Common Framework, recognizing that for countries who are in this debt crisis, actually the only way out is to cancel the debt. But so far, only three countries have applied to the scheme. So Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia. They've all applied to this G20 scheme to have their debts restructured. But unfortunately, there hasn't been any progress for any of these three countries on debt cancellation. And one of the big reasons why that is because there is no way to make private lenders like banks, like hedge funds, to take part in those debt restructuring, those debt cancellation negotiations. So at the moment, private lenders like banks, like hedge funds, they make up 47% of the debt owed by global south governments. 27% of the debt is owed to multilateral institutions like World Bank and IMF, and 26% to other governments. And so because private lenders like banks and hedge funds represent almost half of all the debt payments that are owed by the global south, not having them play ball is a massive block on debt cancellation. Not only does it mean that the bulk of the debt is untouched, and there's no one to negotiate that to 47%, but multilateral lenders like the World Bank and IMF and other government lenders are then become reluctant to cancel any debt, because anything that they offer in debt cancellation will only release funds to ensure that the private lenders get paid. So essentially having a transfer or a subsidy from the public sector to the private sector. So indebted countries end up having to end up being forced into a really difficult position and having to choose either to continue to pay their debts even though they can't afford them, or they have to stop paying, and they risk being politically ostracized by the global community and potentially sued by the lenders for not being able to pay. So, so what can be done about all of this? So first of all, I've mentioned it at the beginning, and I've mentioned it throughout, the debts, essentially, we need debt cancellation. For countries who are experiencing unpayable debt right now, the only way out is debt cancellation. And so we need to tackle the stumbling block here around debt cancellation, and that is with the private lenders. And the only way to put pressure on private lenders to agree to debt cancellation is the threat of not being paid. But this is a very difficult threat for global South governments to wield, because they are fearful of being politically ostracized or treated as a global pariah, or that it would affect their credit rating. And so for global South governments to stick their neck out and either to threaten to default, in other words, not to pay, or to actually not pay, this needs the political and financial support of the IMF, of the World Bank, and Western governments to actually support global South countries to not pay back banks and hedge funds until some level of debt cancellation is agreed. Another concrete way to get private creditors to the table is through legislation. And this would take longer because, by definition, this legislation doesn't exist right now. But it's potentially a medium-term route to getting private lenders to the table. So at the moment, if countries stop paying, they can be sued in the courts in New York or in London. And that's because virtually all international debts are governed either by New York law or by English law. And so if we can get new legislation introduced in both jurisdictions, then we could force private lenders to cooperate with debt restructuring. And how the legislation would work would be that borrowing countries would have to get a debt negotiation or a debt cancellation agreement with 2/3 of their lenders. And if they can achieve that, then the debt restructuring deal would then apply to all of their lenders. And what this would do is that it would prevent a minority of lenders from holding out against a deal. It would also prevent the private lenders who haven't agreed to this deal from suing a borrowing country, because they would be bound by a deal that was agreed by 2/3 of the lenders. And so this is an idea that we are working on in the UK context because English law governs English law is one of the governs about 48% of all debt contracts. And we are seeding the idea with our opposition parties in the UK. And we're also working with campaigners in New York who are trying to build support in the New York Assembly for a similar legislation in the New York Assembly. And so collectively, we're trying to build solidarity for both our efforts to get this legislation in both jurisdictions. Like I said, English law governs about 48% of all debt contracts, and New York law governs 40 to 52%. So between the two jurisdictions, you would cover most of the debt contracts in the world. And then sort of longer term, we also need to prevent future crises. Debt cancellation is a measure that can help in the immediate. It can help countries escape that debt trap right now and really release essential resources for other priorities, such as tackling the climate emergency, such as funding essential public services. And so we, in the longer term, we are working towards a global debt workout mechanism, which would be set up under the remit of the UN. So it would be independent, but it would be an independent body that would conduct a debt restructuring in a fair and transparent way. And so any country who got into debt crisis would be able to apply to this independent body to have their debts immediately suspended while debt restructuring negotiations take place. And then countries would be able to get an independent evaluation of how much debt can be paid by their country to allow for them to be able to meet the basic needs and human rights of their people. And once that is established, the negotiations would take place to restructure debts down to that level. And so I started off by explaining the systemic nature of debt in the global economy. And so ultimately, we also need to go beyond debt cancellation and changes to the debt system itself, as I've just described. We also need to ultimately see the problem as a crisis of the economic system itself. It's a system that is fundamentally racist, colonial, and rigged in the interests of wealthy governments, elites, and corporations. And so we also need to work together across different movements, with the climate movement, with tax movement, trade, aid, finance, to challenge the rules of the global economy, and so we can build broad movements for change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. That was really comprehensive and in such a short time. So really appreciate it. Now we're heading over to May with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. And I forgot to mention, May is speaking to us from 3 in the morning, where she is, I believe, in the Philippines. So everyone give May her due attention, and thank you, May, for making it.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and thank you also to Heidi for laying the groundwork. Now, what I'm going to share, which is several examples from Asia. So I'm with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and we've been around for more than 2 decades now, starting with Jubilee South years before, which was really focused on the debt as an instrument of domination and subjugation by the North over the South. So can I share screen now? Okay, sorry. Okay, so we probably don't have to go into detail about this anymore because we really feel it across the world, and the crisis is not over. So I put recovery in quotes here because it's the language also of the lenders and the North, that we're aiming for the recovery, but we're saying also that we do not want to go back to what it was before. So we're really aiming for something that's transformative and just, and not simply, you know, business as usual. So for Asia, we see more people, millions of people being pulled down into absolute poverty. And it's not only in Asia, it's also happening in other global regions of the South. No? The inequalities are deepening, and at the time of the pandemic, you see more billionaires actually being able to make money from the pandemic. And there's another several millions more that are projected to also fall into extreme poverty in 2021, last year. No? So we are most likely this will also increase for this year because the crisis is deepening for the South and shows no signs of abating. And of course, even before the pandemic, we already saw countries of the South with elevated public debt levels. No? So as you can see here, public debts have really been rising even before the pandemic, which also underscores what Heidi said as the systemic nature of the debt problem. It's now rising to record levels, trillions and trillions of dollars. And as you can see here from this graph from the World Bank data, that you really have increases all over. No? We are here in to the left, far left, East Asia and Pacific. No? And then you see the rest of the world also showing those increases in debt levels. Across Asia, this is also reflected here, and East Asia are the orange bars and are the blue bars, and South Asia are the orange bars. So even as early as 2015, it's already been rising. No? And if you look at the debt service on external debt, no? That's also very worrisome, no? The levels here. And it's already, the share of exports alone has already overtaken that, no? In terms of the debt service. But sometimes if you just look at the news, you would think that the debt crisis just happened with COVID, no? But we know, as I've shown earlier, that it antedates COVID. Simply that COVID-19 really brought into sharp focus the problem of huge debts of the South, which has plagued us for many decades. So it's important for us to understand, as was earlier also explored, that the problem really goes back way, way before, and that it's been worsening over time, and deepening also. So we say that it's important for us to understand this history because that is also key to what measures are we going to pursue, what demands are we raising towards a fair, just, and system-changing solutions. So just a brief history that you can look at more closely later on. That I just share here the some of the beginnings of the accumulation of debt and how this has really grown worse over time. So even as early as the 60s, we already see the period of heavy borrowing, and then of international lending, and then over to the decade of the 70s. As Heidi also mentioned, there was a fall in the price of exports of many South countries, which also led eventually in the 70s to 80s to even higher levels of external debt. No? We also see in this period how the conditionalities really became marked, especially structural adjustment programs, some of which include the austerity packages and tight fiscal and monetary policies, and of course what we very well know as hallmarks of the Washington Consensus, which is privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. And we will know later on, and we will see that even if this happened decades before, for example, the privatization of water, this has also become very critical at the time of COVID because of the privatization of water, which is, has made water inaccessible to the poor and low income. And as you know, that's one of the simplest ways of curbing COVID, no? The washing of hands. So if we move on to the 80s to the 2000s, we also see some of the trends here, such as the securitization of debts. So the use of bonds, which is going to increase more over time. And this also presents its own set of difficulties because as they are exchanged over and over again, it becomes even more complicated to seek out the lenders, no? Or to seek them to account. We also note here some of the debt relief, quote unquote, solutions that were offered before, such as the highly indebted Poor Countries Initiative led by the World Bank. And then we also have after that, because that didn't work, we also have the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative and so on. So over time, we will see how this has been recycled. It addressed debt problems before and didn't work. And actually, those countries that joined these debt relief initiatives are also the ones that are in crisis right now. So I'm just sharing this diagram to show graphically how this accumulation works and the dynamics and the relations, no, between the actors involved. So you have, as Heidi mentioned, the banks and private financial institutions, buyers of bonds and securities. And this is really run as a business, no? Not as a development, not with development goals, as lenders would have us believe, but it's really a business where profit is made, profit is sought and made. And across this lending, policies are influenced and imposed, so they're also able to shape economies. Projects have been established that are not that have destroyed the environment and wreaked havoc on communities and people's rights. We also see the involvement of multilateral, bilateral, and other public financial institutions. So on the other side, we have the borrowing countries of the South, where poverty is, of course, deepening, but it's also used as a narrative to rationalize the need for debts. No? So on one hand, there's borrowing, but on the other hand, there's also pushing or peddling of loans, that this is the solution, that this is the way out of your poverty. And then we have, of course, our own governments are not innocent in this. They're complicit, but also because as they ramp up their borrowings, it's also because that's what's out there, the loans, no? Very few grants, a low level of grants, and then more loans put on the table. So we're stressing here that loans as an instrument of domination and subjugation of the South have really been used to shape economies, to shape societies, no? With the justification that we need capital infusion for development and address poverty. But if we look farther back, no, it's really a legacy of colonization for many countries, as our first lenders were actually colonizers. And it's builds on and has resulted in unjust and unequal economic and political relations, no? Actually strengthened by the dependence on debt also of the South. And the structures and orientation of domestic economies have led to this net outflow of wealth from South to North and the plunder of our resources, exploitation of our labor, and complicit domestic elites. So I just wanted to share also in this little poster here about some of the messages we put out in March, International Women's Month and Day. And this speaks of ecological debt, which is, of course, like the umbrella, no, of which climate debt is part of. So this is when we refer to a colonial legacy, we're saying that this goes way back, and it's not only finance that's the debt, but also social, ecological, no? And of course the climate. And if you look at this debt in these terms, it's really massive and unpayable by the North to the South. So this is also a really solid argument to push for reparations and debt cancellation. So another diagram here that perhaps encapsulates, no, how much the net outflow of resources from the South to the North is. So in various ways, through the repatriation of profits by corporations, there's also illicit financial flows, exploitation and underpayment of labor, and so on. So in return, we get these very low levels of aid, investments, and loans that are also used for their benefit of the northern countries and the lenders. So what are the specific agendas of lenders and investors? Of course, if we look at it as as part of the exploitative system of capitalism, it's really pushing finance capital to make profits through interest payments, using debt and access to credit to impose conditionalities, as I mentioned before. So in the last decade, that's really been very neoliberal policies that that our governments continue to follow to this day, creating markets for products and supply-driven lending. It's important for us to highlight that this is really part of the nature and logic of the international financial system and of finance capital, to deepen this dependence on debt and to reinforce this debt as an instrument of domination. What Heidi earlier mentioned from Thomas Sankara, I've also put here that because this debt is unsustainable, it cannot be repaid, and it actually means sacrificing lives, no? The future of communities. We say that it's actually the debt service, the burden of debt is actually mortgaging our future, because we are borrowing against the future of generations yet to come. So on the debt crisis or debt distress, we often hear these words, and it would seem that this happens at certain periods, but we also argue an alternative discourse that our crisis in the South is actually a permanent debt crisis. If you look at it not from the perspective as lenders, because a crisis for lenders is when the borrowers cannot pay on time, but it's a crisis on the ground when people are hungry, when there's no money for health, no basic health, when their livelihoods are eroded and they become even more vulnerable to the climate crisis. So from this perspective, the debt crisis or debt distress is permanent for the global south. So also mentioned earlier are the supposedly new debt relief initiatives called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, led by the G7 and the G20. And now, after it expired in December 2021, we're being offered the common framework for debt treatments and beyond. But we see this basically as a recycling of past debt relief initiatives that have proven insignificant and trivial. And of course, they do not recognize even if they say that it's structural and systemic, the solutions do not reflect that they really understand this. And it's, as before, it's redounds to cleaning the books, no? From an accounting, the kind of accounting that's being done, cleaning the books so that you can borrow again. So once more, the solutions being pushed are largely debt creating, incurring more debt. No? And it's nowhere near the scale and the depth of the crisis in the world and in the South. So some of these, our criticisms is that too few countries are covered. For example, there's many middle-income countries in Asia, and they're effectively shut out. And this is also because of the kind of debt sustainability analysis that focuses only on uh, per capita GNP, no? So they just look at the levels of national income and then divide it by the population, which is of course really not reflective of what's on the ground because of the inequalities. And there's India, for example, has some of the world's biggest numbers of billionaire, and that you can see, and still you can see the millions of people there in poverty and impoverishment. And not all lenders are also covered. So the hypocrisy here of the international financial institutions, for example, because only bilateral debts are covered by these debt relief initiatives and not multilateral debts. The participation of private lenders is voluntary and merely encouraged. So this is a problem because if you can see here from in the chart to the right, the share of the pie is really for East Asia and South Asia, and this I think is also reflective globally. The private creditors have really overtaken the multilaterals and bilaterals in terms of as a source of loans of governments, and the amounts, of course, are very paltry or meager compared to the scale of need.
Thanks, May. I just want to let you know that we're approaching overtime a little bit.
Okay, so I'll speed up a little bit. So we
Thanks.
also have some schemes from the IMF, and we actually put out this poster that it's profiting from crisis because those countries that are also in gravest need and with large loans are also penalized through IMF surcharges. So this relief comes with a steep rise, and now that the period of suspension is over, it's back to payback time for the South, and we will be facing even greater burdens stemming from huge increases in loans in today and in the near future. No? So that's very important to look at the impacts of the debt, but it's also equally important how policy conditions have really shaped policies and economies. And as I say, it's along neoliberal lines. No? So we also carry the discourse, continue to carry the discourse of illegitimate debt. And as you know, there's the Marcos family is back in power in the Philippines, but there's still this issue of the debt that we have to pay until 2025, and many of these are illegitimate because for these reasons, no, they did not benefit the people in whose name the debts were incurred. They were used for harmful projects. They violated democratic process and so on. So I included here one of the posters also we put out during Women's International Month from Rosa Luxemburg, that credit reproduces all the fundamental antagonisms of the capitalist world. It precipitates the development and thus pushes the capitalist world forward to its own destruction. So those lenses help us see the debt crisis beyond what is currently in front of us, and really exposes its systemic and structural nature. I'm coming to the close of my presentation now, underscoring the call for debt cancellation. So one is, of course, freeing up public funds for urgent needs. It's also providing space to help pave the way for more strategic and structural reforms in the economies of the South. And it's also part of our bigger struggle for system change, that we must fight for, not only for debt cancellation, but also very tightly linked with our other struggles and movements for reparations for the huge historical debt owed to us. And we wage this fight as part of the broader struggle to transform the system that has been built on and perpetuated injustice and inequality, while devastating our planet. So I think this is my last slide, and if we look here at the left, last October, where debt justice movements traditionally come together in a big way during the annual meetings of the International Financial Institution. So this is a summary of the demands, and some of the things we've been doing over this time. So thank you very much, and if you need more information, just go to the website or write to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, May. Powerful and informative presentation at any time, particularly at 2 a.m. And I'm so sorry that we had to rush you through the end there. Just want to make time for Q&A, and I'm sure we'll get to learn more from you. And now on to our final speaker to give us the situation in Puerto Rico, Natalia Renta.
All right, so I want to start by apologizing in advance. I'm trying to cram everything in 10 or 15 minutes. It's just not going to do it justice, but I'm going to try my best. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. One thing I wanted to start with clarifying a little bit, there are so many themes that Heidi and May touched on that will be very clear in my discussion of the Puerto Rico debt crisis, but I wanted to also sort of as a point of clarification, Puerto Rico was still a colony of the United States. So we're not even in the neo-colonial world, like we're still very much a colony of the United States. So part of what that means for this discussion is that actually Puerto Rico doesn't have sovereign debt. It's part of the US system of the municipal bond market. So basically how, cities and public entities in the United States borrow money, it's within that framework. So some of the root causes of the Puerto Rico debt crisis is obviously its colonial status. It's been a colony of the United States since 1898. And before then, it was a colony of Spain. So that means that Puerto Rico has never really had an opportunity to shape its own economic future. And the economy in Puerto Rico has always been run to benefit outside interests. So, that is the nature of a colonial relationship, that it is beneficial to the colonizer, and it's about, extracting value and wealth from the colony. So some implications of that have been that the archipelago and the economy have been set up for US and multinational corporation interests. So, initially that had a lot to do with sugar production. There's obviously been a military interest in Puerto Rico. Where there's been a lot of the US Navy has done a lot of harm there that is ongoing. The harm is ongoing. So More recently, the economy is set up for U.S. multinational corporations. A big player is the pharmaceutical industry. So there were huge tax breaks that were phased out by the government, the federal government in the United States, and they were phased out between '96 and 2006. And the local government of Puerto Rico tried to also pass its own incentives. So a lot of, basically the budget in Puerto Rico goes to subsidizing multinational corporations. Goods are more expensive in Puerto Rico because federal law requires that anything that comes in US ships and with a US crew. And the colonial status has also left it very vulnerable to Wall Street predation. So this, I think, may touched on, some of the ways that finance is able to extract from predatory debt arrangements. So one thing specific to Puerto Rico is that Puerto Rico bonds are triple tax exempt. So they're exempt from taxes at the local, state, and federal level. So they made it really attractive to investors. And so it really facilitated sort of the buildup of this unsustainable debt. So Wall Street was able to peddle some predatory financial instruments, including the municipal bond equivalent of a payday loan. It issued billions in allegedly illegal debt that I'll talk about more later. And these allegedly illegal debt issuance were issued like after Puerto Rico reached its debt limit in its local constitution. And one of the big actors that I believe both Heidi and May mentioned are hedge funds. So one of the things there are some hedge funds that sort of focus on distressed debt. So once it becomes clear that the debt can't be repaid, they buy it at steep discounts in the secondary market to then push for a big return. So in 2000, I'll just come back here a little bit. So in 2015, the then governor of Puerto Rico said the debt had become unpayable and it had reached $74 billion in bonds and $49 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. And there was no mechanism to restructure the debt or of any sort. So basically, the bankruptcy laws in the US didn't apply to Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico actually tried to pass a local law to restructure the debts not of the central government, but the other entities and municipalities. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And also it couldn't avail itself of any of the international institutions, which, have enough issues as they are, but couldn't even benefit from that or participate in that in any way because Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. So basically what happened is that in 2016, the Congress of the United States passed PROMESA. So basically what this law did is it created an unelected and unaccountable control board, which is affectionately referred to as La Junta in Puerto Rico and beyond. So this control board is appointed by the federal government. So it's appointed by the president based on some recommendations from congressional leaders from both parties. So Puerto Ricans have absolutely no say in who these people are, and they have huge power. So they have the final say on fiscal plans and budgets. So that what that basically means is they're able to impose austerity measures. So I think there are a lot of parallels here with some of the strings that come with IMF loans, right? Where they sort of force neoliberal policies as a condition for funds. So here, you have a board empowered to to go against what the local democratically elected government might want to do. And then the other task was representing Puerto Rico in the debt restructuring proceedings. So even though they're supposed to represent the interests, obviously that wasn't the case, let's just say, and there wasn't any mechanism for accountability there. And unfortunately, they were complicit in hedge funds co-optation of the bankruptcy process. So one thing that I want to mention here is, I feel like some people might say, and it has been argued, it's like, oh, well, Promesa was like a good thing for Puerto Rico because there was no way to get the creditors at the table to negotiate haircuts, and this like law made it such that they would have to come to the table. But I just want to sort of dispel any notion of that, in addition to obviously it being very undemocratic and like directly colonial, the imposition of the board, the way it was structured was to extract as much as possible to pay hedge funds, as quickly as possible at the expense of the long-term economic health of Puerto Rico. So I really like this quote from an associate general counsel at the SEIU testifying before Congress, because I think it puts it very succinctly that Wall Street interests wrote Promesa, and that they could have gone one of two ways, like extreme fiscal austerity to make sure that that Wall Street is paid as much as possible as quickly as possible, or actually improving the island and its economy and letting it actually have the tools and ability to decide its own economic future. So hedge funds and their lawyers here, wrote Promesa chose the first path. So what that actually meant in practice is that the board pushed all of these austerity measures. So a lot of school closures, slashing the budget and increasing tuition for the University of Puerto Rico. University of Puerto Rico is a flagship educational and research institution. And it's just, the tuition hikes and the budget slashes have been very devastating. And now we're seeing actually some private equity private equity owned like private schools springing up to basically make up the vacuum. So privatizing energy distribution and increasing consumer prices. So already energy prices in Puerto Rico were very high, and the privatization of it has just lowered the quality of the service and increased costs, slashing public sector jobs, pay and benefits, cuts to healthcare, cuts to municipalities. So again, like all of this, right, is like being done at this for the purpose of clearing up funds to pay outside interests, right, they're just going to pocket those winnings and not don't have a long-term vested interest in seeing Puerto Rico do well. So meanwhile, the board largely ignored the massive tax breaks that were being awarded to US multinationals, and also spent a lot of money on highly paid consultants. So I think this is, a lot of money to be made here. And, there were members of the board and also consultants that the board hired. There were, a lot of conflicts of interest that were flagged that really just put into question who they were loyal to. And all of this also was happening. Puerto Rico was dealing with the effects of Hurricane Maria in 2017, earthquakes in 2020, and of course the COVID pandemic starting in 2020. So all of these austerity measures just made Puerto Rico all the more vulnerable and ill-equipped to deal with this. So the debt restructuring. So we've heard a lot about the need for debt cancellation. Experts at the time said that Puerto Rico, in order to actually be able to get to sustainable levels, had to slash it by up to 80%. And there was a public demand for a debt audit in part, because a lot of this debt was issued after it was pretty clear that Puerto Rico had reached its constitutional debt limit, and so there was a push for a debt audit, and a belief that uncovering a lot of the underlying issues could help get us to some substantial amount of debt cancellation. So one thing that I wanted to give an example of, so the debt restructuring took a very long time, was very complex. There were a lot of different entities to restructure. One big one was what's called COFINA, which are bonds that are backed by sales taxes. So this is another very clear form of wealth extraction, right? So sales taxes in Puerto Rico are 11.5%, which is way more than anything in the United States. And the restructuring plans gives hedge funds that bought the debt at steep discounts, 93 cents on the dollar. So talk about up to 80% cancellation. They're getting almost a full dollar when they paid very little for it. And then for Puerto Rican and small investors got the more deep cuts, and those investors didn't buy it at a steep discount, right? They bought it at face value. And it's estimated that out of just this restructuring, hedge funds got $1 billion in profits. And the big drama was the central government debt restructuring. So that was particularly dramatic because it included bonds challenged as illegal, mostly held by hedge funds, pension funds for public workers and local businesses, and civil rights claims. And it's all coming from the central pot of money used to provide essential services and for Puerto Ricans, all the government expenditures. So one initial victory was that after a lot of pressure from Puerto Rican activists, the board actually filed hundreds of lawsuits against some of the owners of the bonds and Wall Street banks and firms, saying that $9 billion of the debt is invalid. However, unfortunately, it didn't quite stick. So ultimately, the board ended up being complicit with the hedge fund's interest because they went ahead with the restructuring without a debt audit. They kept negotiating up what the hedge funds were going to get without having local creditors at the table. They backed away from the legal challenge that I just mentioned. And they turned a blind eye on some allegations that hedge funds had actually been potentially engaging in insider trading using the knowledge they gained from their participation in the restructuring to make profits that way. And then they ended up also suing the government of Puerto Rico, even though they're supposed to represent Puerto Rico. They sued the government when they passed a law to try to protect pensions from cuts. So another big win for activists was that the pension cuts that were proposed by the board of 8.5% for $1,500 a month pensions, they got rid of that. So again, that was under a huge amount of public pressure. But still, unfortunately, at the end of the day, the central government debt deal doesn't cut the debt enough, of that, up to 80%, they ended up only cutting about 30%. It includes risky financial instruments, and it still significantly decreases future pension benefits of current public employees. So I just wanted to also highlight a lot of the fight in Puerto Rico, right? There was, I'm sure a lot of you saw the big uprising in 2019 against the then governor that ended up in his ouster. There were calls there to take the board with him. There's huge anti-privatization sentiment against the company that is now doing the energy distribution. There's teachers fighting back against their low salaries and pension cuts. There's a lot of anti-gentrification action going on. Also pushback against pharma's, huge profits and wanting to make sure that they pay their fair share in taxes, which they are absolutely not, and that they pay, a just wage, and a lot of feminist action against recent efforts to curtail abortion rights and a bunch of other issues. So what you can do, I just put, I know I'm leaving so many things out, so I'm gonna get it from many people, but just a few things that I flagged here to dig more deeply into this issue. An organization you can donate to that directly regrants to local grassroots and community organizations. And I think like part of the theme of the series is, right, like what you can do within the belly of the beast, which is supporting anti-imperial and anti-colonial policies and practices. So I'm going to stop there. I'm over time. But I feel like I just scratched the surface. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Natalia. That was really powerful as well, and great to really put a face to what debt looks like. We talk about these in terms of numbers and economies and things, and it's important to see what you're pointing out is what this means is the cutting of education. This means kids not going to school. This means closing down of hospitals, that sort of thing. So thank you for that. And thank you everyone for your presentations, really enlightening all around. We'll turn now to the Q&A for the time that we have left. As a reminder to the audience, you're welcome to share questions in the Q&A box. You can include your name or post them anonymously. We likely will not have time to get to every question, but hopefully we can get to quite a few. Unless otherwise specified, this is to the speakers. Anyone can feel free to jump in on a question. Also, you don't all have to feel obligated to like answer one by one. We'll try to sort of get through them quickly, but whoever wants to jump in first. So to start, I just really want to, this might be repetitive to your presentations, but I think it's really the critical point here that I want to hammer home, that you all spoke to the point about the need for real structural transformation, right? So the question is, let's say we win the fight for debt cancellation, all sovereign debt wiped out. What is there to prevent the same debt from just piling up again? What is the alternative? Because we don't want countries to stop having access to funds, which debt is. We want them to have finance. What's the alternative? What other structural transformations are needed to ensure that we don't just fall back into the same cycle? That's a big question.
Yeah, can I take a shot at it?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So we're important that this business of lending is not conducted as a business, no, with the profits in mind. So if it's really for development ends, then that should be reflected in the actual terms and not these terms that lead to deeper subjugation and these conditionalities that force countries into the kinds of measures that actually deepen inequality and worsen the crisis. And we are demanding for more grants rather than loans. And as I also mentioned in my PowerPoint, we cannot do this fight separate from other fights. So it's a comprehensive fight, also synergized with our movements for tax and fiscal justice, for climate justice, for system change, because we cannot expect these reforms to happen without deeper and profound changes in society and in the economy. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, yeah, I think that one of the problems with the demand for debt cancellation, what a lot of people say to us is that when you cancel debt, don't you just isn't just a short-term fix, and that actually over time the debts build up again. And that's certainly what happened in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, as we know, we've covered quite a bit this evening about looking at the history of debts. And then we had that big fight for the debt cancellation in 1990s, early 2000s, where we did manage to win $130 billion of debt cancellation for low and middle income countries across the world. And that was a substantial win, and it kind of released the finances for healthcare, for education, for those essential public services. And then we've got back in the situation again because actually that big Jubilee campaign didn't actually get around to actually tackling, or we didn't get to win the structural changes that we need in the economy. So that's why we're now back in 2022 now, and we're fighting the same fight. We're back in that situation of the early 80s, where we're going to start seeing a whole series of defaults, if not this year, then next year. So we do need to start building in those structural changes to prevent us coming back again and again, because we're fighting for debt cancellation this time, and I think that's definitely a necessity, because we need to stop the bleeding now. We just need to address that crisis now. But yeah, we also need to do a dual track approach where we fight for debt cancellation now, but we also work for those systemic changes, which I talked a little bit about the legislation that we're fighting for in the UK, and we know that our allies in the US are also fighting for a similar legislation, so that the legislation covers both jurisdictions, and by covering both jurisdictions you then get to cover basically most of the debt contracts in the world. And that piece of legislation will basically, for the first time, put some teeth into the system to prevent risky lending, to prevent predatory lending and predatory behaviour. I think that Natalia mentioned kind of some of the predatory role of hedge funds who buy up very cheap debt and then sue countries for the full amount, and they do that because the profit margins are so high, and so this move towards the legislation would help prevent some of that behaviour, to prevent the kind of risky lending that we've been seeing up to now. And then ultimately, much more longer term, we do want to see whether there is any possibility of fighting for some kind of independent debt restructuring process that global South countries can apply to look to prevent future debt crisis. And then also relevant for things like, because we are living in a very crisis-prone world right now, but we also have, there are also disasters that hit countries, things like climate disasters, which is going to become more and more prevalent in the global South, but also, we've seen in the war in Ukraine, suddenly that actually in a situation of great humanitarian need, or a time of trying to build and reconstruct after a climate disaster, we also need an automatic debt moratorium or an automatic debt suspension process that takes place. So rather than a country struggling to deal with the immediate aftermath of a disaster, they're going to, they shouldn't be diverting their vital resources towards paying back lenders in the north, but rather should be able to keep that money in their country to deal with whatever disaster or humanitarian crisis that they're facing. So that would also, I think, be some of the structural things. And then of course there are the wider things which go beyond the debt movement, which are to do with ensuring that we have trade deals that work for people and work for the environment and not just for corporations, sorting out tax evasion, tax avoidance, ensuring that we have some kind of wealth tax, windfall taxes to help fund some of this stuff, and introducing more regulations around transparency and movement of capital.
Okay, thank you. And that actually brings me to another question. Actually, two I'll pose to you, Heidi. One, there's just a clarification question on what does debt restructuring mean? So if we could take a step back and explain that. And two, the legislation that you mentioned, we have a question from, I believe, our member Joe, who wants to know sort of, we're the US-based organization. We have a lot of members in New York. Can you speak a little bit more to the status of that legislation? Who's leading it? Are there any global South countries that are sort of helping champion it, or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So the debt restructuring is a broad term to mean any changes in the terms and conditions of debt. So that could be reducing the amount of debt, which is what we call debt cancellation. So actually reducing the size of the debt that is owed, but it could also do things like stretching out the term, changing the interest rate. So restructuring is a broad term to mean that any changes in that debt to help make that debt more payable for a country, and then debt cancellation is actually the actual reduction of the amount of debt that is owed. So we do, as campaigners, we call for debt cancellation. In reality, it's often a combination of things. It could be a bit of debt cancellation and then maybe some change in the terms and conditions of the original loan. Sorry, and then the second part of the question was
Great,
about
thank you.
legislation. Yeah.
The New York legislation specifically, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So we're working with some campaigners based in New York called the Center for Popular Democracy, and they are at the moment trying to build support in the New York Assembly for this piece of legislation. I think they're not quite ready yet. They haven't got quite enough support to get that passed, which is why they're needing to build that sort of support within the Assembly members before they can feel ready to bring that to a vote. But there's a really important, but that's a New York activity, and actually I think there's also a lot more work that needs to be done at the administration level, and because there is a potential that the Biden administration, or could potentially deem this issue as an issue of international relations, and therefore could potentially veto or quash that kind of activity that's going on in the New York Assembly, and so actually we need to shore up this idea of that legislation. It needs to, so there's very direct work going on in the New York Assembly to actually get this into a proposal, build up the support for it, get that through the system, get that passed, but also in parallel to that, actually building support amongst Democrats in the House and in the Senate more generally to understand what this legislation is all around, to put pressure on the administration not to quash the efforts that have been taking place in the New York Assembly. And like I said, I feel like it's really, I'm excited that DSA have identified debt as a priority for this year. And I think that this particular campaign to try and get the legislation through the New York Assembly is a really exciting one. It's also a very tangible one that would have a really tangible benefit to the wider global fight for debt justice.
Great, thank you. Also, you mentioned Center for Popular Democracy. That's where Natalia did much of her work on Puerto Rican debt. So a good connection there. We have a question from Carrington. May, you spoke about the debt, you sort of flipped the narrative, right? It's the debt the global North owes the global South, particularly when it comes to climate justice, right? Can you speak at all to sort of the question of climate reparations, loss and damage, and even the concept of debt for climate swaps? Sort of, are these worthwhile approaches to take towards debt justice? Can you sort of speak more to this connection between climate justice and debt justice?
So as a perspective, we trace that to the colonial legacy, the extractivism, extracting our resources often irreversibly. And on that basis, we argue for reparations. We say that there's a climate debt, a huge, even bigger ecological debt that's owed by the North to the South. And that's also the basis for saying that we don't want any more loans as climate finance. No, the advanced economies have pledges that they have not met. So we do not want these loans that are being pushed upon us to deal with loss and damage, or to build our resilience, because this must be for funds freed from debt cancellation is separate from what the climate finance is, what the North has pledged to commit to the South, no? And also in compliance with the common but differentiated responsibilities in the UNFCCC agreement, no? So this is really the basis for saying that we oppose the loans that are being pushed, and that climate finance should not be in these forms. There should be more grants and real sharing of responsibilities. No, we also see more corporations cashing in, even on the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to provide largely for the adaptation of the South, but corporations are also, and intermediaries, financial intermediaries are cashing in on this. No? So yeah, so that's one of our major demands in terms of the climate justice fight.
Great, thank you. Now this next question we ask for pedagogical sake, not as a representation of our own position here, but many who hear the call to cancel the debt of global South countries would respond that they are in debt for a reason: mismanagement of finances, corruption, governments that aren't responsible to their own people. There's a simplistic version of this that goes, it's wrong to cancel debt because they made the choices, so they have to take on the debt. There's maybe a little bit more of a sophisticated version of this argument that goes, if we cancel the debts of unaccountable governments, the freed resources would not go to the people, would in fact enable this very unaccountability and corruption. Now, again, as a sort of pedagogical take request, what do you make of this common line of argument?
Yeah, Michael, just I forgot to mention about the debt for climate swaps. That it's basically along these lines also. That first of all, we see debt audits as key to debt cancellation because we cannot just or pushing for restructuring because we do not accept certain loans as loans that we have to pay because they really used to destroy our lives and also our future, no? So debt for climate swaps, you can argue that it goes to something good, positive, but the sovereign right to be able to decide what to do with the funds freed from debt cancellation is also taken away from us. So the argument that, for example, the Marcos debts, that there's corruption, and if we cancel that debt, it's only going to make the dictators happy, no? But we also say that canceling that debt and what to do with the funds freed from that, we have the primary the sovereign right to decide what to do with those funds, how to shape our economies, how to chart the directions forward. So that's also what underpins our position on why we would not want for debt for climate swaps also. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else on this one? No pressure.
I think on this one, I think often that's a very common dominant argument, and that's the kind of the dominant argument we hear from the media, for example, or from the general public. And I think often there is a strong narrative around debt, actually both on personal debt as well as government debt, that it's all the borrower's fault. It's always the borrower's fault, and the lenders are never at fault. And actually, a lot of the work that we do is actually to try to redress that balance. That actually there are times, of course, when you have the borrowers have borrowed money illegally or without the consent of their people. In the case of Mozambique, actually the money was borrowed in a collusion between government elites and Credit Suisse and VTB Bank, which led to a massive debt scandal around debt fraud. So there are cases of that, and there are lots of groups in the global south who are working with their governments to ensure there is accountability and transparency in how their government borrows money. But the other side of that is that actually there are many situations where these loans have been taken out on a very risky basis, on a very where lenders have charged very high amounts of interest to say that that's to reflect the risk that they're undertaking and lending that money. But then when it all goes wrong, they then blame the country, which they've already assessed as a high risk anyway, and then they force them to pay them back fully, even though they've already charged a high interest rate to reflect that risk. So they're kind of cashing out twice over in that sense. And so, I think as a global campaigners working on this, we, like I said, we do need to apportion the blame where it needs to go, and actually when the lenders are at fault, we need to call that out and name that. And especially, like I mentioned about some of the loans in the 1970s, for example, which were given to advance whichever side of the Cold War, actually, to sustain dictators in place. By giving them loans, and it happened on both sides of the Cold War, and so debt was essentially weaponized to advance. And so in those kind of scenarios, actually the lender in that kind of scenario would have been would be pushing loans onto a government where the government hasn't got any democratic oversight of that loan. So those are some of the other kind of issues and perspectives around that question about lenders versus borrowers. But I think I just wanted to redress some of that, because often we always blame the borrower. And actually, and as I said, ultimately we have a system that forces governments to have to rely on debt to cover their budgets because of a global economy that is so rigged against global South countries.
Perfect, thank you. Two quick questions I'll throw out at once. One is from David Kotz, who asks if, I know you don't all work in the US, but do any US trade unions or other sort of groups with a US working class constituency have good positions on international debt, and how could we argue for debt cancellation among the US working class? Sort of what's the case to be made to a US working class constituency? That's question one. Question two, we have from Colin Murphy, who is asking about potentially modern monetary theory. I think most of our sessions, we often get a question related to that. What is stopping countries with sovereign currencies from printing money to buy or pay for what they need? And what is the role of modern monetary theory in reimagining the world order, if any?
I've got to say I don't really know the US context. I'm not very familiar with the US context, if that's okay, and I'm not aware of which trade unions are on board with this, but maybe I can just make a comment on how to connect this issue with working class communities, and also in my mind I'm thinking UK working class communities. But I think for this issue, and actually for a lot of global kind of economic justice issues, I think we need to start from probably a position of shared values, and asking, you know, that actually the starting point needs to be that where we that actually the starting point needs to be around that we believe that, you know, every person should have the right to see a doctor when they're ill, or to be able to attend a local good quality school. We believe that everyone should have enough to put, you know, to be able to feed their families, and to have the essential public services that they need for their lives. And actually that's true whether you live in the US, or that's true whether you live in Zambia, for example. And actually starting from that position potentially is a way of connecting and saying, actually, as we are seeing public services decimated in our own country, actually we're seeing the similar thing happen in other countries. But for the other countries, the public services are being stripped away because of the role that debt is playing, and this debt is going back to the global north, and especially to banks and hedge funds, essentially seeing that transfer of resources away from communities, away from the meeting basic needs of people that we can all relate to, and lining the pockets and bringing profits to banks. And actually the interesting thing about debt cancellation as well is that certainly for targeting private creditors like banks and hedge funds, is that actually we could potentially, like in the case of Zambia, they could actually negotiate quite a good deal on debt cancellation for Zambia, which is one of the countries going through the G20 common framework that we talked about earlier. BlackRock, which holds a significant amount, which is a global fund manager, they hold a significant amount of the Zambian debt. They could actually cancel quite a significant proportion of it and still actually make a profit. So that's how much profit that they are actually making. So I think I would probably, if I was trying to connect this issue with working class constituency, is actually bringing it back to shared values, and then explaining how debt is playing a role that is stripping people of the ability to just live their lives and just be able to thrive and have the opportunities that we all want to have for ourselves and for our children.
Thank you.
Michael?
Yeah,
on the I don't know much about MMT, but my simple understanding is that if we print our own money, we'll never run out of it. Something like that. No. Maybe there's more than that. But perhaps you also need to understand the political economy of southern countries, that there's also elites that control the policies, and that globally, vis-a-vis the US dollar, we really it's really dominant, and our own government, Philippine government, is very much the ally of the US for many years already. So it's not a simple thing, and then I would imagine that this would also require changes parallel if we want the system to work. That it's not simply applying it per se.
Thanks. Yeah, if I might take moderator's privilege here to speak a minute. I believe as well, modern monetary theory, I believe, applies much more strongly to countries with strong currency positions like the US dollar, as opposed to other countries who are taking out their debts. Typically, it's denominated in the US dollar or other foreign currencies, which means that printing more would essentially not work. But it is an interesting question of how it might affect the overall international system. I'd love to learn more about it. Thank you. We're coming up on time, and I want to be respectful of your time, especially May, as hopefully you can get some sleep. The just final question is, do you have any final remarks? Anything you'd like to add in the last remaining minutes? If not, that's fine too. You've already all said very much. We've learned a great deal from all of you. Thank you all for coming. I guess we can round out a few minutes early. We've learned a huge amount. Really appreciate it. A huge thank you to all three of you for joining us and for all the work that you do. Thank you to everyone in the audience for coming and your participation. We had a lot more questions in the Q&A that we couldn't get to, so sorry about that. But I think any of them would take us over time. Please be sure to join us at next month's session. We don't have an exact date defined just yet, but it's the next session of the Intro to Global Econ series. We'll be digging into the role of the World Bank and IMF in the world as weapons of neoliberalism and empire, which we've touched on today. I believe at least one of our speakers who's confirmed is Jayati Ghosh, who some of you may know. The details there will be announced, so everyone stay tuned. I see you're unmuted, May, so I'll give the opportunity if anyone does have final remarks. Okay, if not, then thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure. Hope you have a good one.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you to DSA.